Hello, Dru Johnson. It is just really, really great to see you. And everybody who watches this, I want to introduce you to this unusual man, Dr. Dru Johnson, who is a theology professor at the King's College in New York City. And I have in the past introduced him as the oddest person I know. If you check him out, out there in cyberspace, you're going to see his own bio written by himself, and it's odd. So you'll see what I mean. But in any case, I'm very proud to talk with Dru as a key player in Longing to Know and the Longing to Know story as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of Longing to Know. And I want to say too about Dru, I feel about you that you've been a colleague of mine, through the majority of those 20 years. And I was recalling just recently one of my memories of connecting with you at a conference where after hours we were in the pub and we must have been in swivel seats and side by side, but other people came up to talk to both of us, only it was each of us, and we swiveled away from each other and we were back to back. And I think to myself, I don't know anybody else that I've been back to back with doing like the same thing together, like collaborating, kind of like Aragorn and somebody in the battle.
Is that a Lewis reference?
Aragorn?
Yeah, I don't know the reference.
Lord of the Rings?
Oh yeah, I've never read them.
Oh, so
I'm a bad white Christian.
Yeah, okay. All right, so enough talk from me. Say to the people listening a little bit more about you, but also then your involvement with Longing to Know and the Longing to Know story.
Yeah, well, I'm honored that you would even think of me as a colleague, because I always show up in your presence a little bit intimidated at all times because of the role you play in my life. And enough about me. Let's talk about Longing to Know, which I got to see in a draft version in a class that I took with you back in 2001, 2002, somewhere around then. And again, I had read Polanyi by that point, but of course I only understood a tenth of what I read, maybe a fifth of what I read. And it was through knowing you that I really started to understand how Polanyi informs and shapes kind of everything we think about everything. I quit trying to compartmentalize him, and I just kind of let him breathe and let him be through seeing how you opened him up for me. And then I remember reading Longing to Know and thinking, wow, this is a book I could hand my mother on these very sophisticated topics. And honestly, every time I hand somebody that book, I say, look out, you're going to read it and you're going to think you're just reading some things where you'll nod your head and go like, okay, yeah, this all makes sense. And you're actually reading very shrewd philosophizing disguised in the garb of common sense storytelling and reasoning and prose. But every move she's making, she is slicing and dicing entire intellectual traditions. So don't be fooled by the power of this book.
Yeah, that's neat. That's neat. And you've taught the book.
I have. That's right.
You've probably taught the book more than a lot of other people.
Quite possibly. But it's fun because it's fun to see students react to it as well. And I mean, it's always so fun to watch other people have the same reaction that you had, and to have the kind of like, wait, what? Like this, hey, this changes everything if I start appropriating, or that. I'm sure you have this all the time where people, they get into the orbit of what you're saying and you can kind of see them weighing whether or not, because they can feel the indeterminate future manifestations of the system, right? They can feel the implications. And they're making decisions like, wait, if I keep going, I might have to rethink kind of everything that I've thought at this point. And that's the beauty of the book, is it slowly cracks that egg rather than jarringly against the side of the pan.
Kind of like the road to Emmaus.
Right. I mean, there's two ways, when I talk to my students, it's kind of like a wrestling match. I'm like, we can go hard or we can go easy. Right? Which way you want to go, but you will not leave this room unchanged. So.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. So here we are 20 years out on this book.
And we don't look a day older.
Well, well, speak for yourself. Um, but what do you think the thing? How do you think the thing is still viable? Do you think the thing's still viable?
Yeah, I realized it's interesting. I read that manuscript, and then I read the book subsequently when it came out. In the middle of seminary, where you're reading, like 12 books for every class. You're just reading lots of books, and even then, I remember developing the skill of like, oh, this book is good for this present time and what I need, what we kind of need to think about. And then some books you read, you're like, oh no, this is transcendent. This isn't locked in the 80s or the 70s. This isn't a parochial conversation that's going on then. This actually kind of transcends. People will be reading this 50, 100 years from now and getting something from it. And as soon as I read this, I was like, oh, this is one of those books. Again, well, because you instantly start making a list of people in your head as you're working through the book going, oh, so-and-so needs to read this. Oh, okay, now so-and-so needs to read this and so-and-so. In every conversation, you find yourself going, have you read Esther Meek's Longing to Know yet? If you haven't, you should put that at the top of your list.
Oh, neat. That's
So
neat.
I mean, I don't even think of it as 20 years later. I think for me, it enters the realm of, and I know this because I talked to lots of colleagues and academics who have read it. Kind of like I think Dallas Willard's work as well. It's just not locked into time and space in the way that quite honestly, a lot of my stuff is.
Well, say a little bit more actually about it, and thank you for that. What you've done with what you got from Longing to Know. What's the trajectory of your unfolding?
And I've told you this before, but it bears repeating, is, Esther Meek's name could be footnoted at the bottom of like half of the pages in every book I've ever written, because it transformed kind of everything that I thought about. My great concern was it was so cohesive and so explanatory, had such power to the explanation of reality, that when it got to the details, would it actually work out? And particularly, I'm interested in, like, with Scripture. Does it actually cohere with Scripture, or is it a nice smear on Scripture? Because every time I'd see you bring Scripture in the classroom or bring Scripture in a discussion or a lecture or a talk that you gave, I thought, oh, that's good. Oh, that works really nicely. But quite honestly, after reading a lot of theology, in my graduate work, I realized that I read a lot of stuff that sounded good. But when you get in the nitty-gritty of Scripture, it doesn't quite mesh. It doesn't quite add up. So my PhD, in many ways, was a challenge from our colleague. I hate to call him a colleague too, but Mike Williams, who was also a mentor of mine, who basically said, you talk a lot about your epistemology, and he's referring to your epistemology that I've appropriated. You talk a lot about it being biblical, but you haven't really done the work to show that it's biblical.
Whoa.
And that was the okay, that's what I need to do. And I really started my PhD day one. I kind of threw everything up in the air and said, I might have been wrong about everything. And let's look at Scripture and see what it's doing with knowing, and ordinary knowing and complex knowing, and all the different ways that it goes about it in community and through ritual. And I think I did this always happens, is I discovered, the book was truer in ways that I couldn't have imagined. And also there were different emphases in Scripture that popped out that I was like, oh, okay. If we were to go back to Longing to Know 2, or the next iteration, I might say, hey, pump this one up a little bit more, because it comes up a bit more in Scripture than I might have suspected. So
Yeah, name that. What would one of those be?
Well, it's one that you actually turned me on to before Scripture, but the authoritative voice that is authenticated, right, to speak. I just didn't realize how, almost the entire timeline of Israel and the New Testament church can be divided by to whom they're listening and who has that authority and how are they accredited. And so I think accreditation mechanisms actually come up quite a bit, which they do, and obviously in Polanyi, and I remember reading a very early essay of yours on authority and the role of authority and knowing. So it's not like it's not present, but certainly in that biblical work, I realized that this goes to the top of the list for me. It actually takes a primacy in a way that I hadn't appreciated previously. You probably had, I just hadn't. So.
Well, that's appropriate for Scripture too.
Right, of course, yeah. It sounds so obvious now, right? When I came home from 2 years in Scotland writing my PhD, and the little old ladies at church said, now, what did you study? And I said, well, I wrote basically a book that says, in order to know reality and God and all these things, you need to listen to God's voice and do what he says. And they're like, I remember one of them looking at me going, you had to spend 2 years in Scotland to figure this out? Like, I could have told you that. So
Yeah.
I was like, well, I had to actually show that it was there, and in the actual text, the Hebrew and the Greek, etc. But
one of the things in one of your books early on that I especially remember is how you talk about Genesis 2 as an act of coming to know before sin.
Yeah. Wow.
And
good catch. I'm glad that stuck.
Yeah, well, I think it's valuable. And I also, I really liked what you did with John, the authoritative guide. These are written that you might believe at the end of John. And I have great respect for Thomas, actually.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Who got it right in lots of ways. So
yeah, and again, Mike Williams was the one who turned me on to, hey, don't write off Thomas. There might be something more complex going on there, and it's just so, especially as someone who came into Christianity with a lot of doubt as a young man. Like that just opened so many doors for me that I didn't have to fight so many battles that I would have wanted to fight otherwise. So
that's neat. That's neat. Well, I am so pleased to have this connection with you and share it with other people. And I wonder if you have any parting shots, and then we'll sign off.
Well, yeah, I think for me, there is this is going to sound like an exaggerated claim, but it really is in my personal timeline, excuse me, and how I think of the world. There is a before longing to know, and then an after longing to know. Kind of everything changed when I entered that world of Esther Meek. And then, of course, everybody who knew you, it's kind of like, well, how do we reproduce her? And so the idea that I have a book that I can hand people that can say, like, let me introduce you to Esther Meek. And it really captures her well, and it's well written, and in many ways. And I even tell students, you should model your writing on this. This is a good standard to go by. And we all know how you felt, how dreadfully you felt about my early writing that has gotten better over the time, thanks to you.
We do not all know about that, thankfully.
Yes. Esther is not afraid to tell somebody, hey, your writing sucks, and you need to get a hold of it.
Authoritative guide, as you know.
Exactly. But you knew that I needed to hear, like, very firmly, this is not good. You need to turn this around. And so that was
all right. But let me say what it was you were doing, and that was you were introducing a new subject in every sentence, and that to me was a sign of your, the many-sidedness of Dru Johnson, which is incredible.
Hey, I have had these students who do this to me as well, and I have the same talk, and I get to say, don't feel bad. I was you. I had to sit across from someone I respected highly who had to tell me, stop doing this, right? So, but again, that idea that I can take this in a book and hand it to somebody, and then they get all the goods of being around Esther Meek and all the breakthrough, and it spurs conversation. It helps them understand their family, their childhood, their community, their philosophy, everything better. Like that. I mean, how many books actually do? Everybody promises that in a book proposal, but how many books actually do that? So that's my love of longing to know, not loving to know. That's the other one we're going to be celebrating later.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, Dru, thank you so much for that. And thank you for your continued service over the years, and so much that you do, and so many people that you bless and connect with. So I'm real proud of you.
It's a pleasure to carry on the Meekian tradition.
Thank you. Okay, everybody. Bye-bye. I'm going to sign off.